I want to start out with the question of why there are so many Jewish crooks.
Crooks or cooks?
Crooks.
You know them?
Yeah, Ganovim.
Okay.
And by that, it's a catch-all for, I think, a general problem of why we find that in some of the most influential movements in history that have had some have had some very negative repercussions. We have so many Jews at the forefront of those movements. And why are we always shooting ourselves in the foot? And we really find that theme here, where on the one hand, it's not because, right, there are anti-Semites who would say the reason why there are so many Jewish crooks, and of course, I don't mean to say it in a, I'm not necessarily buying into the narrative that there's a higher rate of crookedness among Jews than there is among any other people. But somehow, I think we end up on the front page more than other people. And I think that may be a function of anti-Semitism in the press. It also may be a function of the effectiveness of our crookedness. This week's Torah reading, on the one hand, has the Ten Commandments and the Shema, the first paragraph of the Shema. So it has really the most exalted verses in the entire Torah are incorporated in this week's Torah reading. Right? I am the Lord thy God. Where this week's Torah reading is Parshat Vaeschanan, Numbers, starting from Numbers 3:23 and going until Numbers 7:11. On page 765, on the bottom of the page, I am the Lord thy God who brought thee out of the land of Egypt. I mean, that's the Ten Commandments. That's the highest moment in Jewish history, the most spiritually exalted and the highest peak of human achievement is to hear the Ten Commandments, this spiritual achievement. And then we move a little bit on, page 769, Numbers 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, which represents the possibility, the potential for the highest aspirations of a human being, to be in love with God. I mean, can you imagine something such an amazing expectation for people to have of themselves, for God to have from people. And yet, at the same time, we have these words like let's see, page 759, Numbers Deuteronomy 4:16. Lest you deal corruptly and make yourselves make a graven image, the form of any figure, the likeness of male and female. Lest you raise your eyes, verse 19, lest you lift up your eyes unto the heaven, and when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, you be drawn away and worship them and serve them. 4:25. Excuse me. This is the Torah reading of Tisha B'Av. We read it last week. We read it this week on Sunday. When you shall beget children and children's children, and you shall have been long in the land, and shall deal corruptly, and make a graven image, the form of anything, and shall do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, to provoke him. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day that you shall soon perish, utterly perish from off the land whereunto you go over the Jordan to possess it. The Lord shall scatter you among the peoples. And then, of course, just lest anyone read these verses and think that this means that the covenant between God and the Jewish people is subject to being nullified. Right? Let's not forget that. You could take some verses from the Torah out of context, and it's going to say, oh, if the Jewish people have turned away from God, therefore the God will delete his covenant with them and make a new covenant, right? You know what I'm talking about? No. Verse 30. In your distress, when all these things are come upon you in the end of days, you'll return to the Lord your God and hearken to his voice, for the Lord your God is merciful God. He will not fail you, nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your ancestors, which he swore unto them. Okay, so it's in the book. There's no second covenant. No new covenant. And even in the Ten Commandments itself, in this high moment of divine revelation, which is described as being 5:4, page 765, the Lord spoke with you face to face in the mountain out of the midst of the fire. Right? So in the Ten Commandments themselves, we have do not murder, do not commit adultery, don't bear false witness, don't covet your neighbor's wife. Right? So in this highest moment of connection with God, we have, it's almost like, what are you taking me for? It's like, if we're so holy that God is speaking to us, do you expect that the same people who hear God's voice would need to hear, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't covet your neighbor's wife? And of course, the reality speaks for itself, right? But I think that in a way, we live in a kind of inconsistent, a philosophically inconsistent space where, on the one hand, we expect that holiness would be holy, meaning that holy people who hear the voice of God would be somehow more pure. And yet, our reality is undeniable that not only do holy people fail, but it seems almost that that the holier someone claims to be, or the holier someone is regarded, the more likely they are to have problems. And again, I'm not denying the fact there's this other factor, which is the dog bites man phenomenon, right? Which is that the newspaper is always going to report on the newspaper is always going to report on the more surprising news, which is, a rabbi was caught with X, Y, or Z, or a Jewish person was caught with doing X, Y, or Z, or lahavdil, a priest, or a celebrity, or it's something that we don't expect, and therefore is in the news. But at the same time, the fact that the press sees that as dog bites man is evidence of this conflict in our minds between, if someone is holy, do we expect them to be pure? I think I guess that's how I would sum up the whole thing. If someone is holy, are they more likely to be pure? Yeah? You would think, right? So I'll put it to you then in another way. Which is the most vulnerable, the most self-corrupting? Which part of our body is most likely to do us in? Mouth. Yeah. Why do you say the mouth?
You can corrupt through eating and drinking, and you can corrupt through wishing harm.
So you can corrupt society.
Right.
You can corrupt society by speaking. What's the part of us that ruins our own self? That ruins ourself. So
from the brain.
Right. I would, to your point about the mouth, right? It's not so much the mouth that eats the food that's bad for us. It's the brain that tempts us to eat food that we know is bad for us. Right? The mouth doesn't have a will of its own, but the brain is so vulnerable to self-corruption, right? Self-doubt, depression, anxiety, existential angst, right? Temptation, right? Where do our inner demons live? They live in our brain, right? And so it's not surprising to us that the most vulnerable part of us is also the most sophisticated part of us. And I'd like to explore why that is. What's the relationship between spiritual sophistication and impure impulses, let's say, right? The impulse to be corrupted. What's the relationship between them? What do you think?
Well, some people who feel that they're very holy know how to overlook their own various.
So people rationalize. They overlook their own faults and they rationalize them. Yeah. What do you say, Professor?
Well, a sophisticated mind can dream up more things than a salt of the earth kind of person who lives a simple life, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. I think that what you said earlier, Betty, about people who cover up their own faults, I think that it speaks to a certain pathology, right? The people who overlook their own thought. Right? I would say there are two kinds of corrupt people, let's say in general terms. There's the pathological narcissist, the sociopath, right? So sociopaths are highly intelligent and sophisticated, and their failure is in their inability to see themselves. Yeah. Then there are the people who struggle with emotional problems, and there the problem is too much self-awareness, right? So the depressives, the anxiety, the anxious, the self-doubting, the self-harming, I don't know what the catch-all term is. Not sociopathic. It's not sociopathic, but it's something else. I don't know. Emotiopathic or something. I don't know. Make up a word. But you know what I'm saying? The problem there is too much self-awareness. And by being in that space, we end up eating ourselves up from the inside. Yeah?
But I think both things stem from the idea of being self-centered.
Yes, that's true. That's true. It is both from the idea of being self-centered. The rabbis say that whoever is greater than their fellow is going to have a greater impulse to evil, or a greater impulse to negativity, more specifically. By negative, I mean, right, so I think it's important to reiterate this, that when we say evil in the Torah, Ra, we normally think of evil in the sociopathic sense. In Western thought, when we say the word evil, we think in terms of sociopathy, right? People that are doing malice and that are heartless and cruel and malicious, right? But the word Ra in Hebrew is a catch-all, includes both the sociopathic as well as the emotiopathic, where a person simply, the question is this constructive behavior and thinking, right? And if it's not constructive, then it's negative, and therefore it goes into the category of Ra. There's a binary in Judaism of Tov and Ra, good and evil, right? Good and bad. And the binary means that either you're being constructive or you're not being constructive. Either you're being positive or you're being negative, right? And that includes both doing things to myself, doing things to others, as well as thoughts and feelings that are harmful and not constructive. Yeah? So when we say whoever is greater than their fellow will have a greater propensity to negativity, right? Kol hagadol gadol mechavero, yitzro gadol hemenu.
Maybe there's more temptation. Yitzro gadol hemenu.
Right. So there's more temptation, but I would also say that it's, if I'm gonna look in a real way, temptation is only part of it, right? There are some that suffer with temptation, but I think that the more systemic issue is that this sophistication itself and the spiritual being on that spiritual level comes with, inherently, systemically, it comes with a certain quality of being of having that capacity to negativity, right? And it's
part of humanity,
right? So so here's the thing, right? Things have much less capacity. Things don't have it at all, right? Animals, I also think, don't really have it much at all, this negativity, right? A little bit, but not so much, meaning animals do get depressed. That's a thing. But people have it to a next level. And people who are on a higher spiritual level have it even more. And I think it's so. I was reading the Maharal, and Maharal is talking about why it is that it's specifically in the moment that the Jewish people are given the Ten Commandments that immediately after that they fall into the sin of idol worship. Meaning or it seems to me also that within the Ten Commandments themselves we have this reference to human weakness and failure. And so Maharal says a very interesting thing. He says that if in this moment when a person becomes spiritually advanced, they are on the border of being an angel. And if they wouldn't have these temptations, if they wouldn't have this capacity to be corrupted, they would be angels. In different words, you could say that that everything in this world, so we can look at it kind of from a creator's point of view, right? From God's point of view, let's say. That everything needs to have a force and an opposing force. There has to be a check and a balance. So in order to keep things as they are, there always has to be the positive force and then the negative force that balances it out. And so the higher the positive force within the person, the greater the opposing negative force will be in order to keep the person a person. Right? I spoke about it on Shabbos, that it's on the hardest day of our life, on the most painful moments of our life, we're also the strongest in those same moments. Because otherwise we would, meaning in those moments, while we may feel the weakest, but we're actually expending the greatest amount of energy just to stay alive. This is why often people who struggle with addiction often go from one addiction to another. Meaning, it's common that, for example, people who struggle with overeating, when they stop overeating, will start shopping. Right? For example. Well, if you mortgage your home in order to pay for your shopping habits, then yeah, it's pretty bad.
Little retail. They don't mean the shopping.
Yeah. So the reason, so
people who stop smoking go to eating.
Yes, that's true. Yes, so there are medical reasons for it, right? There is the old hole in the soul reason for it, that it's not the addiction. It's the addiction is not the substance; it's the hole in the soul, right? That's the 12-step terminology. But also that another reason is that we congratulate ourselves for the win, and we feel like we deserve we've earned the treat, right? And that treat then becomes another addiction, right? And so what I'm saying is that the energy that it takes, and sometimes the problem is that the energy that it takes in order to, for example, stay away from cigarettes requires so much energy that they just, need something needs to feed that, and so they'll end up. So we end up sometimes. Another example of this is that when we're tired, we're more likely to lose our cool. Right? Why is it that when we're tired, we're more likely to snap, more likely to lose our temper? I think it might be because it takes so much energy. We're focusing all of our energy on just staying awake, just keeping on moving, that we don't have the presence of mind then to keep ourselves calm.
I also notice when I'm extremely tired, I want to eat.
Right.
After flight, I'm so tired. I'm so busy. I'm so overwhelmed that I think I'm hungry, but I'm really not hungry. I'm looking for food.
Right. So I think the same is true. So this is sort of from the Creator's point of view, that there's always got to be a balance and a counterbalance, right? In order for things to be what they are. And the greater something is, the stronger the counterbalance will be. From the creation's point of view, from our inner world point of view, I think it's important for us to be aware that it's the same inquisitive and transcendent and spiritually minded qualities that can bring us to the highest of high can also bring us to the lowest of low. So just for an example, in order for us to know what's going on around us, we have to know ourselves. If you really want to, what does he say? Those who learn about the world dream, and those who learn about themselves transform. So if you really want to have any kind of real understanding of what's going on, the first place to do that is in understanding yourself and knowing yourself very well. And thus, with self-awareness comes the capacity for self-absorption. And along with that also comes self-doubt, comes anxiety, comes selfishness, right? Comes narcissism, comes depression. And so I think it's important to be aware that our own strength is inherently also our own capacity for weakness. It's the same tool. And thus, it's particularly at the moment of receiving the Torah that we are made aware of our capacity to sin. It's specifically at the moment of having the highest revelation of God that we seek out idols. And therefore, I think that when we see that holy people are not pure, we shouldn't be surprised.
I don't know if they're so holy. Maybe their appearance seems holy.
So this is what I'm arguing against. I'm arguing against this cynicism that says that because someone sins, therefore they are somehow, it shows that they're less than. I think on the contrary.
Well, it does.
How do you mean?
It does show they're less than holy. They're human, that anyone can make a mistake. We know that, but to say that they're holy, no.
So I guess we have to clarify what we mean by holy. So holiness, if you talk about holiness as an accomplishment, right? So as an accomplishment, so you're right, my terms may be a little bit imprecise. if holiness is an accomplishment, then yes, when someone sins, they've definitely not accomplished holiness, right? But if we talk about spiritual sophistication, if we talk about someone being close to God, not as an accomplishment, but as a state of mind, would you still say the same? Maybe I'll put it to you in a straightforward question. Yeah. If someone struggles with depression, does that mean that they're not close to God?
Well, of course they're not. They cannot be. It's called Selmavet.
Or so fine. Then let me refine my question. If somebody struggles with depression, does this mean that they are not qualified as a person? That they have less potential for godliness? Put it that way. You think so? You agree?
No.
Why not? So let's hear. So you're saying because depression is inherently ungodly. Yeah. And you're saying that
there's a potential there. Resolve the depression. I would say, if you ask me what somebody who is holy is, I'd say basically the absence of sin as far as the human being, and also good deeds, and that, right. I would say following Torah, doing things for people.
Right.
I would say that would be.
So you're talking about holy in terms of the absence of sin. So that's sort of that's a scorecard, right? That's you're talking about when we tally up the person's deeds. How many good things have they done? What are their accomplishments? And I'm talking about the psyche of the person. What is the nature of the tool? What is the kli? And to use a Hebrew term, what is the nature, the mahut of the person, right? Does the nature of the person who struggles with depression mean that they are by nature have a less godly capacity? Or a person who struggles with addiction, or a person who struggles with anxiety, or a person who struggles with whatever. Does this mean that their mahut, that their kli, that their essence is somehow has less godly capacity?
Yeah, and especially with depression, that can be chemical, so it's not even a function of, their personality, their nature.
Okay, so leaving chemicals aside, right?
I think it's the midot is more than the midot will put you in the right direction. While you're talking, I remember once I told my son, "You're very intelligent." My husband used to give him all kind of articles about people who did, he always looked for a loophole to go to do something that's not supposed to be according to the law, but he found a loophole.
Yeah.
And my husband used to bring articles that all kind of people who ended up in prison because they were too smart and wise guys. So there is a line between being honest. So he came to me and he says, "Why are you always giving these articles to me? What do you think I am? I'm not a crook." I said, "Listen, Michael, calm down. I want you to know, God gave you a lot of intelligence. You could use it for the good. You could use it for the bad. It depends what you do with it. Now, you are gifted. You are gifted. The only problem is that you are trying to be a wise guy sometimes and look into to different ways of doing things that are not really, it's kosher, but it's twisted. And that we didn't like."
Right.
And he got it. Finally, He got it. I think this is the same thing.
Yes.
A kind of a balance with everything in life.
Yes.
The Orientals say yin and the yang.
Right.
Something like that. Of course, lahabdil is not like this, but
I don't know that it's not like this.
Or maybe it is this, but lahabdil, because it's a different concept, it's a different idea, it's a different culture, it's a different religion.
What I'm saying is that it's a natural law. Okay. Right. So I don't think that we have to apologize for sampling that language, because I think it is a natural law. So to your point, I think so. What the point I'm trying to argue is that we have an expectation that when someone struggles with negative, dark, corrupting impulses, that this means that there's somehow pasul, that they're not that they don't belong in the realm of the spiritual, that they don't belong in that this says that somehow spiritual advancement is not available to them, because they're a corrupt kind of person. They're a loser. And it goes. I think it goes across the board. You can have, again. There's as I said before. There's the sociopathic, right, and there's the emotiopathic, right, where one would be called a loser and the other would be called a crook, right there. But it's the same overthinking that leads us to be depressed, as well as that leads us sometimes to find to be an oiber chacham, to be so smart that we're stupid, right? But the point is that same quality of overthinking things is also the same quality that brings us closer to God. Meaning, if a person is going to be looking at things just as they are, they will see the world as a world, and it is what it is. If a person begins to think deeply about things and to begin to think under the underlying purpose and cause and patterns, they begin to discover God's hand in the world. And so the same capacity to see patterns and to see God's hand is also the same capacity to somebody says a compliment to you and you think, did they really mean that? Are they trying to use me? Are they trying to work on me? Trying to take advantage of me, right? Or do they really know, do they really know that, or, the people, he gave me a compliment, but, I don't really deserve it because the X, Y, and Z. No, you did good, leave it alone, right? There's such a thing as a straightforward thing. You did good, take the compliment. No, but life is not that simple. Right? But it is that simple, right? So the more simple we are, the easier it is, the less prone we are to these corrupting influences. The more complex we are, the more sophisticated we are, the more capacity we have to be accomplished spiritually, the more capacity we have to achieve in holiness, it's that same tool that will that has the capacity to drag us down. And therefore,
so depression is positive or negative?
Depression is the negative outcome of a very powerful tool. The same powerful tool that can bring us to the highest of high. So again, of course, we're not talking about, I don't know, we as a human race are in the infancy of understanding our emotional workings. And, they used to say that when psychopharmacology first became a thing, so the buzz term out there was that it's to correct your chemical imbalances, right? The fact of the matter is there's no such thing. By now we understand that there's no such thing as chemical imbalances. If it were true that there was such a thing as chemical imbalances, then you would be able to take a blood test and see that someone is depressed, right? Which you can't do. That's not to say that at one point it won't be discovered, but the term chemical imbalance was more hypothetical than actual. It was a term of art more than anything else. The fact is that psychopharmacology has helped many people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that depression is not a spiritual illness. In the way that, for example, exercise helps depression, right? So you see there that it's physical, but so does meditation and prayer help depression. So you see that. So what's pshat? Okay, I think that it's a complex question, right? It's a complex issue. This was one of the highlights for me of the Democratic debates was Marianne Williamson, who was Jewish, by the way. Check her out; she's a very interesting person. Many of the things that she said, many of her policies, I don't agree with, but one of the big chidushim, one of the big unique things that she said was that we have that politics, that America has, or say the American political class has sought to excise, to remove the spiritual, and therefore we're always treating symptoms, and so every problem has a policy to fix it, and we're putting band-aids on everything, when in reality most of the American people understand that these problems that society is facing are spiritual problems that are solved in the context of family, community, and congregation. Not my words, not hers. But these, in her words, these were the domain of family and religion and spirituality. And so to your point about clinical depression, I think that there is a point at which a person's depression becomes so severe that it can be clinically diagnosed, and that it has a manifest, tangible impact on a person's ability to function in the way that a clinical illness does. But at the same time, I think it shouldn't be ignored that at the core, at the root of depression, and by depression I'm saying all negative impulses, and that is the ability to destroy oneself as well as the ability to destroy one's surroundings. At the core of all of those things is sophistication and the ability to overthink, the ability to think deeply, the ability to be self-aware, the ability to analyze. All these abilities are the same, is the kernel of what begins to drive all of these negative impulses. And therefore, Ani amarti Elokim atem, uvnei elyon kulchem achen ke'adam temutu. When I said that you were gods, that you were exalted, that you were the sons of the exalted, or that you were exalted ones, so you would die like men. That it's the same quality. It's this. So I want to give. The reason I'm saying this is because I want to give chizuk to you and to me and to all of us. Both when we read in the news about members of our people who have done terribly dark things, as well as when we look in the mirror and we see our own darkness, that we shouldn't see this as a sign that we are in some way inherently bad, or that we don't belong on the spiritual path. No, on the contrary. The fact that we see so much darkness in ourselves and in our people sometimes is a sign that we most belong on the spiritual path, and that we can achieve the greatest on the spiritual path by following those same tools. And so and maybe the answer is in the Ten Commandments themselves, and in this dichotomy itself between the Ten Commandments, the first half and the second half, the thou shalt nots and the thou shalts of the Ten Commandments, right? There are three thou shalts in the Ten Commandments and 7 thou shalt nots, right? So the 3 thou shalts: I am the Lord thy God, honor your mother and father, and keep the Sabbath holy. Keep the Sabbath holy, honor your mother, honor your father and mother. Is the antidote to the negativity. And going back to the other great passage in this reading, which is the Shema, love the Lord your God, which is to say, remember that God took you out of Egypt. Remember that your parents have a tradition, that you didn't give birth to yourself, right? You come from somewhere, that you have a tradition, you have a legacy. And remember that you can't necessarily fix everything. And make time for a Sabbath. Connect to your legacy and your history, and remember that it's about God. Point 1. And point 2 is, remember, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. It's not about you. So remember to use the tools of sophistication. Remember that when we use the tools of sophistication on ourselves, we can sometimes be self-awareness, which is using ourselves to understand the world, to understand how we interact, can become self-obsession, right? And so remembering that it's not about me, that I am here to serve, I am here to help, I am here to learn, I am here to worship, I am here to become part of something greater than myself. It's almost like when we're called to serve and we become important, we have to watch out not to become self-important, right? I think that's the key. It's like giving somebody an important job, like the Jewish people have, the project that we have, right, which is to bring awareness of God into the entire world, right? That's the most important of all tasks. But in the calling to the important, there is the capacity to become self-important. Just like in the gift of self-awareness becomes the capacity to self-absorption. Yeah?